Welcome to Riding Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. In recent years, grievances over federal management of public lands in the West have escalated to armed standoffs, occupations of federal facilities, and violence. Then, just last week, while Congress was certifying the Electoral College results of the 2020 presidential election, months of politicized rhetoric about supposed election fraud inspired an attempted insurrection and violent takeover of the U.S. Capitol. There's a common theme in the rhetoric espoused by the people involved in these different movements, that tyrannical government has taken something away from them, access and usage to lands in the West, or electoral control of national affairs. The overlap in membership and rhetoric between these groups is meaningful, and the history of public lands conflicts and grievances in the American West provide essential context. In this month's episode of Riding Westward, we talk with Professor James R. Skillen about these issues and his recently published book, This Land is My Land, Rebellion in the West. I'll introduce him and his work in just a moment. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, let me take a quick moment to explain a bit about the podcast. Each episode features a conversation with authors, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, academics, or others who write about the North American West. Our goal is not only showcase their work, but to spark curiosity among you, the listeners, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who call it home. If a writer intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Riding Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing the roles of host, producer, sound engineer, and just about everything else, all of which entail tasks for which I have very little training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and all the work is well worth the excuse to read more and to talk to interesting people. At the end of this episode, I will include some more information on me and my scholarship, and on the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. With all this business out of the way, let's move on to today's conversation. First, I'd like to introduce to you who it is we're talking to and why. James R. Skillen is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at Calvin University. His new book, This Land is My Land, Rebellion in the West, was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. Building on his previous work on the history of federal land management in the West, Skillen has now turned his eye to understanding the recent politics of land management and how certain Westerners have resisted federal oversight and regulations, as well as how very regional Western debates over grazing permits and local control over land use have melded with national movements against the federal government and increasingly extremist and militant stands against supposed federal tyranny. The growing overlap between those in the West protesting federal land management policies with so-called patriot groups, anti-government militias, extreme conspiracy theorists, and white nationalists makes understanding the historical context of their Western elements essential. Unfortunately, Skillen's book is timely and demands our immediate attention. Professor James Skillen, welcome to Riding Westward.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
We tried to do this about a week and a half ago at the very beginning of January. I like to try to get the podcast done at the beginning of the month. And I had some things come up and we had to reschedule for mid-month. But in the interceding days, there's been some crazy things that have been happening and that I think we'll be able to talk about today with January 6th and the riots and insurrection mobs. And so maybe it was providential that we had to postpone.
Well, I sometimes, as someone who talks about and writes about federal lands, I sometimes think my audience is only in the West. And so this happens to be a moment when, I think what have been writing about is certainly of national relevance.
Yeah, we always hope that our work will be nationally relevant, except when it's in unfortunate contexts, right? Well, this book, where you're trying to make sense of some of these recent conflicts in the West, at Bunkerville or Malheur or elsewhere, and trying to provide some of the context of the long brewing Western conflicts over public lands, the role of the federal government in managing lands, and so forth. And this all builds off of your previous work on the history of the Bureau of Land Management. You had a book referred to it as the nation's largest landlord. Could you start by explaining how that previous work led you to go down this particular avenue for this new book project?
Thanks for the question. When I started working on federal lands, I was drawn to public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. It'll seem silly. I was drawn to it mainly because I found so little written about that agency compared to the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of that is its complex history, but also that the lands it manages are not as easily recognized by the public. So a national park is a contiguous unit with a boundary. It has signs at the front. It's on Rand McNally atlases. Public lands, partly because they're interspersed with state and private lands, they simply aren't seen by the public as units, as places. And so I think it's received less attention from the public for that reason. I think the individual programs that the BLM manages, grazing, mining, recreation, they've received a lot of attention. But I was also drawn to public lands managed by the BLM because to me, there was a more immediate sense of an older history of the West on these lands. And as I interviewed people who had started with the Bureau of Land Management when it was formed in 1946, or maybe started with a predecessor agency in the 30s, the stories I was hearing to me sounded like old Western films. You know, there was still a kind of lawless range, little pockets in the West. And I think that captured my imagination. After that book, The Nation's Largest Landlord, I wrote a book on federal ecosystem management. And it was, looking at how the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service in particular were working on ecological management and finding that, the friction that caused, even the phrase ecosystem management, caused enormous political friction. And so I had been spending time around the West in the literature, just paying attention to some of the ways that language in the 1990s had really created conflict throughout the West. And I had been aware certainly of the Sagebrush Rebellion of 1979, but the work in ecosystem management really got me into what I see as the next Sagebrush Rebellion, the one after that pretty much ran through the 1990s. And so I'd been spending a lot of time with that. Really, this book, the idea for it came during the Bundy Ranch standoff in 2014. And I mentioned this in the introduction. Having written on the Bureau of Land Management, I was fielding calls from reporters. And one reporter who is British, worked for Reuters, lived in New York City. And his first question to me was, Jamie, is this really happening? And it was mock incredulity, but I think I understood. I mean, he's asking, particularly from a place in the East where comparatively land claims are settled, where, there's pretty strong law enforcement presence. To him, it seemed really like a different world that you could have independent militias staring down federal law enforcement and appearing to win. And I think that really is what many people are probably asking about what happened at the Capitol last Wednesday. Did this really happen? When you turned on the news and you saw images of people climbing walls and scaffolding, I mean, basically crawling over the Capitol, it really, it's a fair question.
Yeah.
How could this be happening here? And so it was a similar sense during the Bundy Ranch standoff that I decided that what I wanted to do was try to explain to that reporter, to a reading audience, why in a certain way, in a qualified way, what happened at the Bundy Ranch standoff made sense, why it wasn't shocking if you put it in historical context.
Interesting. What we saw at, Bunkerville or later at Malheur, it seems like something like out of an old Western movie. It seemed to confirm every Western trope and stereotype from dime novels and films and so forth. And I don't know if people farther east ever think about the West. When they do, it's probably often in films, but maybe when they do, they also are like, yeah, but that's just films. It's not really like that. It's not really the Wild West. And they turn on the news and, what is going on? Although, we did have Ruby Ridge and Waco, there were other moments of somewhat adjacent kinds of events and violence that happened out west. But I mentioned this we had Leah Satilli on the podcast to talk about her long form journalism and her podcast, Bundyville, and
which is outstanding. Her work is really exceptional.
Yeah, and I just discovered she has another podcast about Oklahoma City bombing, which I have on my queue. But I mentioned to her, I'll mention to you as well, that my wife was driving from Arizona back here to Utah in 2014 with two very, very small children in the car by herself. And she went the Las Vegas route and calls me up and says, Brendan, I'm stuck in the middle of the desert. There's like a traffic jam. Like, what is going on? Is there a wreck? So I got online and was Googling around, and the kids had to go to the bathroom, and finally, after a little bit, a little news item popped up, and I called and I said, I think there's like an armed standoff of like some militia group or something. And she was like, what? And sure enough, she was stuck for a couple hours and drove by these guys with assault rifles and sniper rifles. And she was the same thing. Is this really happening? Is this real? So I think that's great that we all had this moment of incredulity. But if you understand the history and the context of what's going on, it's not that unbelievable. And I think right. By the end of our conversation, I think we're going to return to what happened on January 6th, and it's maybe not as unbelievable as we might think as well.
Right.
Let's get into some of this context and dig through the history of these conflicts between the BLM and various groups. In your book, you move us through a number of phases of discontent. The Sagebrush Rebellion of the late 70s, early 80s, the 90s, where things are a little less cohesive, but it did become increasingly more national, even corporate in a way in some of the movements. And then the Patriot Rebellion movement, you call it, during the Obama era. What I found interesting, I wanted to start talking about, and we'll move maybe through all those phases as well, but through all of them, they all seem to invoke certain ideas about Western identity, about what it meant to be a true Westerner, and how that played into who should control these lands. So I'm curious if you could offer us some thoughts about what do you see as some of the main through lines? What are these character points or attributes or parts of Western identity, Western authenticity that all these movements have kind of woven into their rhetoric as a way to justify and give them authority in proclaiming who should control lands and so forth?
I would like to take that question in particular in take one angle, which is thinking about ways in which a Western identity has in fact been appropriated nationally within certain conservative rhetoric and imagery. And I think this is also key to understanding, let's say, the difference between Ruby Ridge and Bunkerville. So if you look at Ruby Ridge, you have, someone somewhat reclusive living in a cabin in Idaho, understood publicly as a white separatist, understood as a marginal figure. Even among people who had at the time real discomfort with federal authority. And that didn't mobilize national support the way the Bundys did at Bunkerville. And I do think that part of what we see is the degree to which, as a certain conservative narrative built over the last 40 years, and as some conservatives were casting about for icons or symbols of conservative America, of traditional America, of a nostalgic age in American identity. The Bundys sort of stepped right up at a moment when that image was incredibly powerful. So it's the image, and you even saw this with Ammon Bundy. Images I saw of him when he lived in Phoenix were different than the images of him at Malheur Refuge.
There's a certain costuming that goes on
Yeah.
when in different contexts.
Yeah. And I think I don't want to oversimplify it, but this really is the icon of the American cowboy. Never mind that they're ranchers and not necessarily cowboys, but the American cowboy that, in fact, I mentioned in the book, there was a resolution in Congress in 2005 to declare a Day of the American Cowboy. And the language of that resolution was all about how the cowboy embodies all that is good about America: honor, tradition, commitment, hard work, individual responsibility, etc. And when I read a lot of the material about Cliven Bundy in particular, there are a couple of kind of hagiographies celebrating him. And, one of the things you see is you hear phrases like, he loves, the Bundys love and respect their women. The Bundys are hardworking. The Bundys are, and the list goes on, and it's basically reinforcing a certain idea of patriarchy, a certain idea of work and responsibility, a certain idea of independence, whether or not, a public lands rancher could ever be fully independent. And so I think that really part of this story is the story of people all across the country adopting or co-opting a particular Western identity and then holding it up as a symbol of what's been lost in this country. And that's why, too, if you listen to, during the Bunkerville standoff, one of my first questions is, why does Sean Hannity care? Right? I mean, here's a New York Fox News personality. I'm fairly confident he has no particular interest in ranching or public lands. Why is it that he would take such an interest? Well, it has to do with the fact that for conservatives, the Bundys and that Western identity of the cowboy really served a purpose, to remember a forgotten past, however mythical it really was.
So this mythical identity of the cowboy, it evolved, and Owen Wister and others in movies created this. I mean, if you read through kind of cultural studies about film and Western films, there's a lot of discussion about how the cowboy, stood in for America and represented, a lot of things in those films and books. And so you can see places where the Bundys or others then, they are ranchers, but they specifically try to invoke what that cowboy mythology meant. And then more broadly, people nationally then latch onto that and hold on to that. I talk to students about this sometimes, when we have Ronald Reagan kind of costuming himself, as this cowboy, right? He was invoking, again, the certain imagery, but it's this imagery of that true Westerners, which are the true Americans, are rugged individuals who tamed the land, savage lands. They're independent of others, independent of the government. And that's what true American identity is. But underlying that all is the fact that land users in the West, especially in these more marginal areas of the rural West, are perhaps the most dependent people there are in the nation in terms of being dependent on federal support. And the white settling and peopling of the West was one of the most long-term, expensive federal projects in the nation's history. That's the grand irony, is this narrative that these rugged individuals came out and conquered the land, and the Bundys, for instance, are carrying on that legacy. When in fact, railroads, the military, building forts and confining Indians to reservations, or killing them, all these things, and then this huge federal transfer to private ownership through the Homestead Act and Desert Land Act, all the other things, it was all a federal project. It was not rugged individuals, braving the wild on their own.
Right.
Kind of this grand irony.
And I think the second, I realize what I said a minute ago was more circular in answering your question, but I think that I can say more directly, the other thread that I see through these rebellions is the thread of American civil religion. What all of the people, whether it's, the Sagebrush Rebellion, rebels of 1979, but certainly through the Patriot Rebellion that we see today, it is people who say they stand for America as God's nation, an exceptional nation. If you're Ammon Bundy, it is about God inspiring the Constitution and putting in that document inalienable rights from God. And so I think, too, one of those symbols is in these rebellions, it's people who are saying, I'm not just fighting for my personal interests, right, material interests in land. And I'm not even just fighting for a Western identity. I'm fighting for what's truly American. And, if you go back into...
And fighting for God. I mean, the stakes just get higher and higher certainly. And higher.
It's remarkable. And you hear, I think what was helpful in some cases with Ammon Bundy is he was articulate about this. He actually could draw on a theology, however sort of marginal or out of the mainstream. He was drawing on people like Cleon Skousen very heavily. And, he had a pretty well-formed political theology. And I would say, too, that this is where we see both kind of Mormons and evangelicals being some of the real energy in this movement today. And it all kind of circles around this notion of this American civil religious notion that we are protecting God's country against the infidels or the pagans, so this really is something that is of cosmic significance, at least in the rhetoric. It is not merely about land rights or cows or wildlife refuges, because what else would be so important that you would be able to draw, if you're Ammon Bundy, you'd be able to draw people from New Hampshire, from Kansas, who are all going to show up and appear to be willing to kill and die for the Constitution. Well, that cause has to be something pretty significant. And even participating in the cause is what gives, I think, some of Bundy's followers that sense of purpose and identity. How do they know their cause is important? Because they're willing to kill and die for it. It really does become quite circular, though, yeah. Because we'd have to ask the question, is it a cause appropriate to kill and die for? But it sort of is a self-reinforcing sense of purpose.
I also think the fact, with the Bundys in particular, that it was playing out over this desert landscape that to most people has no real monetary value. So all the other considerations, of, well, are these people just trying to get rich? Are these people, is there some real important resource that they're fighting over? That's their ulterior motive. But really, for most people in their view, there wasn't anything else. And so what they were fighting for was principle. They were right. fighting for principles, not for actual, right. material gain, which again kind of elevates the sanctity of the movement and the rhetoric. Well, maybe we should kind of go through some of these time periods, and maybe starting with the Sagebrush Rebellion. Walk us through what that movement was in the late 70s, early 80s, because I think there'll be a lot of keywords and things that make people's ears perk up. Like there's a lot that we will recognize from more recent things in that Sagebrush Rebellion. So what was it? What was it in reaction to? And how did it kind of play out and then fizzle out by the early 80s?
there's historian Richard White has this wonderful phrase. He said that he describes kind of the federal government as, if you think back to the 19th century, first 2/3 of the 20th century, so the federal government was like an itchy wool sweater. It might be uncomfortable, but if it's the only thing you have to keep you warm, then you're going to wear it. And so for much of that, the development and the white settling of the West, there certainly were resentments about the role of the federal government, that it was dictating the terms of land use. And yet the federal government was investing so much money, as you point out, it was making that settlement possible. So there was a kind of uncomfortable, maybe, alliance between Westerners and Eastern politicians. What really happens is that in the 1960s and 1970s, there is a sea shift in the way that federal lands are viewed and managed in the West. And in fact, the Sagebrush Rebellion has almost nothing to do with the more iconic federal lands like Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone. The Sagebrush Rebellion builds because in the 1960s and 1970s, it becomes clear that public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management and to a lesser extent the Forest Service are not going to be privatized. They're not going to be given to the states, and that some form of more professional management is necessary. The BLM, in fact, on its own was sort of building these professional capacities to manage the public lands pretty much the same way the Forest Service was managing the national forests for multiple uses.
More oversight, more scientific inquiry, kind of, and a more robust bureaucracy to do it.
Certainly. And in fact, rather than what one early grazing official called home rule on the range, that is deferring to public land users as to the best use of the land, BLM employees were making those decisions based on their own training at universities and their own professional judgment. And then that all, through a series of government studies and legislation, I would say the inflection point is when Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act in 1976. This was the act that for the first time said public lands would be in permanent federal ownership. Just as controversially, it extended the Wilderness Act to public lands managed by BLM. And at the same time, the BLM was exercising the authority that Congress was basically recognizing in that act, as opposed to creating whole cloth. And so what you see are Westerners who are saying, we are losing control of lands that we have, in a Lockean sense, we've mixed our blood and sweat with these lands, they're ours, and now all of a sudden we're being told what to do with them. On top of that, you have the Carter administration coming in, and the Carter administration made plenty of enemies beyond land issues with water issues in the West. And so the Carter administration was really leaning more heavily on some of the environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act. And all of those things came together to create this sense of that a true Westerner was being disenfranchised by powers outside of the West, or certainly out beyond their control.
By Eastern bureaucrats, right?
There you go. And probably urban Eastern
bureaucrats and ivory tower academics who came up with these scientific studies and so forth.
Right.
While they're out there for the last 4 generations, mixing their blood and sweat with the dirt. And I mean, and there's, you can be empathetic with that.
Oh, absolutely.
These are families who for generations have, many of them, scratched out very marginal lives on very marginal lands. Some of them did quite well, but some of them, it's hard work, and now the rug's being pulled out from under them. That's kind of the feeling.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And in 1979, the Nevada was the state that you sort of see as launching the Sagebrush Rebellion. And the state legislature introduced or passed legislation demanding that the federal government turn federal lands over to the states. Now, here's what's hard to imagine, though, from today's perspective. 85% of the state legislature co-sponsored that bill. And what's just important, it was entirely bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans were not quite equal, but Democrats and Republicans were both supporting this effort to take back federal lands. And part of what you see there is that sense of identity of being a Nevadan, being a Westerner, was so much more powerful and so much more important than the party identity. And so you ended up then with this grand statement that these lands are our lands as Westerners. And pretty soon, Utah followed, other states followed. But what's important to recognize, particularly as we think about what's happening today, is almost in all of what happened during the Sagebrush Rebellion was what I would think of as mainstream political activity. It was state legislatures passing laws. It was people lobbying Congress. There were demonstrations. There were protests. People happened to have guns. But this was not, and at that time, too, if you look at militias in the 1970s were still largely, completely marginal fringe groups, explicitly racist. Their project was building, Aryan utopias. So what you really saw was Westerners concerned with material issues with federal lands, banding together in a bipartisan fashion to demand control over that land. And what President Reagan did in running as a sagebrush rebel is, he came in, he spoke specifically to them and said, I'm not going to give the land to the states. We're not going to privatize the land, though that was attempted. He says, but you know what? I will once again defer to you. Secretary of Interior James Watt said he went and talked with the state governors, and he said, this land is yours. Take it. I'll do what you want. And in doing that, Reagan simultaneously diffused the Sagebrush Rebellion. I mean, what was there to be angry about if, no, the states didn't take title to the land, but they received what they'd really asked for, which is greater control. But Reagan did something that's even more important when we think about what's happening today, which is Reagan understood the common grievance that a rancher in Nevada had, that let's say a conservative Christian in the Southeast had, or a white supremacist in the Southeast, or business owners in the Northeast. What he recognized is the grievance was government. And Reagan then helped connect and unite what had been these sort of regional issues, school or integration, certainly workplace safety was more Eastern than Western, but all of these ways in which people saw the federal government meddling in their lives. And Reagan said, you know what, we're all in this together. We have the same problem, different details, but the same problem. And so even though the Sagebrush Rebellion was, pretty much dissolved by Reagan's action, it also was setting up a coalition so that the next time these issues erupted over federal lands, Westerners wouldn't be alone in or at least the issues wouldn't just be about lands and resources. They would then be inextricably linked to a whole set of grievances about the role of the federal government in American life.
And this is really part of the genius of what Reagan did in the rise of the New Right, was building these coalitions, right? Taking even the portions of the Sagebrush Rebellion, which were kind of anti-Carter political theater in a way, but then uniting them around principles that weren't just about land, about these broader issues.
In the book, I described the Sagebrush Rebellion as a 10th Amendment rebellion. So the 10th Amendment, which upholds the broader powers of the states over and against the federal government. That really was what the Sagebrush Rebellion was about. But as you're describing, the coalition that forms is then bringing together people who are, so by the 1990s, the rebellion is, at the very least, a First, Second, Fifth, and 10th Amendment rebellion. It was about religious expression. I mean, it was about everything from prayer in schools and abortion to Second Amendment, gun rights, to Fifth Amendment, particularly private property rights. And so, yeah, it basically became a Bill of Rights revolution as opposed to a states' rights revolution.
Yeah, it's kind of wrapped up in some of the broader culture war issues, right? So this is what you explained starts playing out through the 80s and 90s, where we have basically what was a regional conflict, and it becomes instead a regional front in this broader national coalition of discontent that's challenging federal authority. How does that then change what was the Sagebrush Rebellion or these broader movements of Western discontent? How does it change their character as they become less grassroots, more tied with national organizations, national concerns, national funding and subsidizing? How does that change the nature of Western opposition or challenge to federal authority over lands?
Boy, there's so many things I want to say. So much could be said. What I want to emphasize is I think what happened during the 1970s and 1980s created a whole new foundation and infrastructure for what happens in the 90s. There's an outstanding book by Jefferson Decker, The Other Rights Revolution, Conservative Lawyers and the Remaking of American Government. And what he argues pretty convincingly is that in the late 70s, early 80s, you see a concerted and organized conservative effort to build what conservative strategist Paul Weyrich called a weapons system that would be capable of counteracting the progressive or liberal rights revolution of the 50s and 60s. He says, it did a number of things, whereas, the progressive rights revolution was about showing the Constitution protect the rights of minorities, of women. The new rights revolution he writes about was really about protecting economic interests, about protecting corporations, about protecting property, about protecting conservative interests. And so what he describes, and I then describe as it relates to federal lands, is this explosion in the late 70s, early 80s of conservative think tanks, foundations, lobbying groups, political action committees. Really, if you think about, my guess is almost any conservative think tank or action group you think of, most of them were formed in about 1978 to 1982. And whether that's, conservative public interest law firms, whether it's ALEC, his collection of states, whether it's, many of them were formed in that period. And so by the time we get to the 1990s, when public land or federal land issues became contentious, it was no longer just the public land users that were going to enter the fray, that were going to go to Washington or were going to demonstrate. You now had the James Watts of conservative law. You had a variety of these groups that were now going to ensure that that coalition built in the 70s and 80s came together on behalf of Western public land users. And what you see, the way that that really changes the language, is that in the 1990s, the main focus is no longer states' rights. The main focus is private property rights and individual rights, because those are the issues that every American can be concerned about. So even though it dealt with public lands, it was really people claiming that their private property rights to public lands had been taken. It was people complaining that, federal oversight was restricting their freedom of expression and gun rights. And it was also, this is when you have the kind of county supremacy movement. But it is of a different character. And I think none of that could happen. And it certainly could have been sustained over the entire decade just by the Westerners who used public lands. It could only be sustained if it had the kind of institutional infrastructure that was carrying the message to Washington, that was, where leaders were traveling the West speaking rallying people. And so it was in the 1990s a very different, I would say simply a different coalition
Yeah.
that was involved.
This is something of a paradox then, isn't it? Because so during the 80s and 90s, we have, in a way, a mainstreaming of these Western grievances, or the Western grievances are put into a context of these broader national mainstream political debates. But it's also during that same time period where extremist groups, militias, also become enmeshed with these movements. So on the one hand, Western land grievances are becoming mainstreamed, but at the same time, entering into that stream are much more extremist groups, which set up what you describe kind of as we get into the Obama era as the Patriot Rebellion, which is very different in flavor. So I just find it interesting that at the same time we have a mainstreaming of this and a radicalization of it in a way, or a broad acceptance of more radical elements within it.
And I think that's exactly right. I think what you can't separate that too from the articulation of the threat that people I'll call the rebels, but I mean conservatives protesting the federal government. The way they articulated the threat against them, it was not that the federal government was limiting grazing permits. By the 1990s, part of that radicalization is the broader acceptance of conspiracy theories that the New World Order, the UN, was going to destroy America, that Russians were sending troops in, that FEMA was beginning to, build internment camps for Americans. And we don't have time to discuss this a lot, but I think it is critical to see that none of this could have happened without changes in communication technology, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the 70s, people were sending out newsletters. There's a limit to that reach, but you do begin with changing of the law that used to require balance in news coverage, the rise of cable news networks, the rise of early kind of bulletin boards in the internet that really now allow people to gather together around conspiracies that are so dark, and that, of course, your response would be more radical. I mean, it's different if you think, it's one thing if you think you're going to have 10% fewer animal unit months of grazing next year than if you believe the Russians are going to come and take your children. And that has only continued. And that certainly is what we saw, last week, where if you listen to the conspiracy theories and you listen to QAnon, I mean, look, if I believed the things that I've heard from the kind of QAnon realm, I think I'd be radicalized too. And I don't think everyone actually believes them. I think many people mobilize it, but I do think, again, it's radicalization, not so much for its own sake, but by constructing an enemy that is so much more dangerous that it demands some kind of greater response. And that, given the fact that it is defending against federal tyranny across the board, and again, this is where gun rights become really critical, and where, guns become one of the central political symbols. It's the number of, you've probably seen the God, guns, and Trump signs and flags and memes, but the way the NRA would say it is, that's because the Second Amendment is the one that protects all the others. So you do begin to hear more rhetoric, and I'll add one other thing, more rhetoric about the NRA's relatively new insurrectionist interpretation of the Second Amendment. That it's not just that you should be able to keep and bear arms for malicious service against foreign invaders. It's that you need to keep and bear arms so that you can kill federal tyrants when they come against you. And, that's now been 30 years of that constant drum of warning you that you may have to defend yourself against the federal government, and you may have to defend yourself violently, not aggressively. You're told it will be defensive, but because the federal government is going to come at you in a way that will require violent defensive force.
Yeah, that's a more long lasting justification for a lot of these feelings. Whereas the Sagebrush Rebellion, was a response to some very specific events, right?
Mhm.
New federal legislation, new regulations by the BLM. These are really big, broad ideas, about federal tyranny. And that is an enemy that you can churn out rhetoric on for decades and
Sure.
gain followers and
Right.
use as a platform for all kinds of things. Instead of it just being a flashpoint, being a regional Western thing, it's long lasting. Which kind of, which brings us to, and we've kind of already talked about them, Bunkerville and the Bundys in 2014, occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon in 2016, and all of that building and blending with these other very extreme things. And we have some very uncomfortable bedfellows at times, people
Sure.
that are, opposed to federal control on very kind of constitutional grounds, sitting next to violent militia extremists who want to, and white supremacists and others, this very strange coalition. You write that this also during the Obama era, you write that this kind of melds with the Tea Party movement and transforms, Western grievances over, roads and wilderness or resources into what you call, you write, into a new and more dangerous rebellion waged by armed militias and vigilante groups. You entitled your conclusion to the book "Wither the Next Rebellion," and books take a while to go through copy editing and publishing and everything to get it out on shelves. So you wrote that a while ago. But maybe we should turn for this last little bit and talk about what happened last week on January 6th. And I did not see a lot of invocation of Western, of kind of that Western cowboy identity, like we did explicitly with the Bundys and others. But in what happened last week, where do you see the echoes, the ghosts of all these previous movements bubbling up? Maybe less explicitly, but where do you see it and what's happened over the past few weeks?
I will say in the last week, I've read a number of pieces on this where I think people are trying to understand a linkage in one direction from Western, the Bundy standoff kind of activity to what happened at the Capitol. And
I think High Country News had a piece.
Yeah. And it's not that I'm not criticizing that, but I think what we've been talking about is that almost treats as if it grew out of the West, or it was the Western rebellion that caused what we saw at the Capitol. What hasn't gotten enough attention is the other direction. That is how other forms of radical and extremist agendas really in the last 10 years have propped up Western public land disputes. So I already mentioned, when you have people from all over the country rushing to the Bundy side in Bunkerville and Malheur, not because they care about federal lands, but because this is their cause, you realize that the Bundys could not have succeeded in what they did without that support and push from across the nation. The other thing, and I want to still focus on Ammon Bundy for a moment, if you've tracked his activities, including getting arrested twice at the Idaho State Capitol, and there was one beautiful image of him being wheeled out in a comfortable office chair, which seemed to me to belie the rhetoric of a violent, tyrannical government.
I said that to my wife. I showed her this picture, and it kind of explained the context. I think he's handcuffed to this rolling office chair, and I said, "That's the image." There's a lot to unpack there.
But I think that his work, since he's moved to Idaho, has had very little to do with federal lands. If you think about what he's been protesting, it has mainly to do with, COVID-19 mitigation gave him the focus of his ire against the federal government. So he's been mobilizing people not around federal land issues, but just against government overreach, broadly construed. And so I think when I look at what happened at the Capitol, it is entirely of a piece. As you say, the costumes were slightly different. What you saw were more fatigues, more camo, more military symbols. You also saw, and this is pervasive throughout the West, a lot of symbols of the American Revolution. 1776. This is the new revolution. So in that sense, it really is. I wouldn't just talk about a connection. I would say it's become the same movement. It's just attacking different symbols of federal authority, whether that symbol is a national wildlife refuge or almost the ultimate symbol of federal authority, the Capitol. What I would say is simply the emboldening and the degree of this is remarkable. There are two things I want to add about about what happened to the Capitol that are critically important. And the first is columnist Gary Wills once referred to people in the 90s, the rebels in the 90s, as constitutional anti-governmentalists, which is just a beautiful mouthful. So what is it that would make one utterly faithful to the Constitution and yet entirely against the government it creates? What is it within this movement that makes it pro-military and police and yet anti-government that directs those forces? And one of the key things we have to see is the element of popular constitutionalism. So if you are to say that you are there to defend the Constitution, yes, indeed, to potentially die for the Constitution, the next question someone should ask is, well, who gets to decide what it means? What interpretation of the Constitution are you dying for? And part of what has come out of a lot of right-wing sources, mainstream like Glenn Beck, when he was on Fox News and others, is this notion that ultimately it's the people that decide what the Constitution means. It is not the courts. It certainly is not the executive branch or the legislative branch. We, the people, decide what the Constitution means. So it's a kind of constitutional, it's populism and fundamentalism. It says simultaneously that the Constitution doesn't need any interpretation. Its meaning is entirely obvious. And that I, as an American citizen, have the final authority to determine what it means. Well, when you look at what happened at the Capitol, and you wonder, well, how could these people be describing themselves as patriots storming the halls? Well, again, they're saying we're here for the real Constitution, not the meaning that's been perverted by the judiciary and by the elites. It's what any American who loves this country knows that the Constitution means. And I think that has made, I won't even call it a movement, it's made the dynamics we see today more volatile, because you ask, who is it that will help us create a common understanding of this Constitution? It certainly isn't going to be Twitter or Facebook. So how will we forge a common interpretation of what this authority that's supposed to be a governing, all of American government and aspects of our society, what that really means?
You write towards the end about Trump, and I'm seeing kind of some new connections here about how he kind of built some of his coalition and where it's led us. You say that he appealed to Americans who felt that their country had been stolen from them. And I'm thinking now about, back to that Sagebrush Rebellion and others who, that was their grievance, their country more physically, in terms like that their land and their access and use of land had been taken from them, stolen from them by a tyrannical government. And these more recent movements today are often about people feeling that that their voice in defining how the Constitution is interpreted has been stolen from them, right? Mm-hmm. There are still people that are determining these things and are running the country, but it's not their people. It's not the right people. Their voice has been silenced, um, which again, which is maybe why this Western land grievance set of movements so organically and naturally was integrated into these broader things. Maybe that's why Reagan so obviously saw the imagery he could use and the commonality of these grievances that he could really tap into and use to build coalitions, because they really are, they dovetail so perfectly.
Yeah, I think, when I think about the coalition today, any sort of summary commentary on the movement that led to storming the Capitol, it is going to be insufficient and, in fact, in some sense, counterproductive, because simplifying it is going to be really challenging. I mean, I talk with my students about how, Smokey the Bear gets a bumper sticker that says, "Only you can stop fire." What you have room for in a bumper sticker is fire's bad. What Smokey really wants to tell us is some fire's bad, some fire's good. There isn't room on a bumper sticker for that nuance. And I think one of the things I really want to emphasize in talking about coalitions is one of the things Trump helped make public were the explicitly racist elements of American conservatism. But one has to be careful, because just because white nationalists are part of the coalition doesn't mean everyone in the coalition shares those particular values. And where you have to, what will hold them together, though, are only then the broad threats that we share in common, right? And I think where I'm a little bit hopeful with public lands in this moment is I'm not Pollyannish, and we're not just going to hold hands and, gather around the table and, rediscover America. But what some of the public lands do is they give us something concrete to talk about. They give us something physical, measurable, limited, so that if we can find places where there is something specific enough to address, will this help us? And there are other areas of society, but I think in the West, where this might be able to keep us from, so globalizing this idea of a threat against us that it becomes too amorphous to even address, but it becomes precisely amorphous enough to harness every grievance imaginable.
And boil over in really terrifying ways.
One of the things, if I could add just one other thing here, when we think about the kind of culture wars, the two Americas, and, I'll add the caveat, it's not that simple, but I co-authored a piece somewhere else, actually with my father, who's a political scientist. And as we were listening to some of these, some of this language and some of this narrative, he gave me language in this article that was really helpful. We talk about how within the United States, there are two Exodus stories. So if you're familiar with the story of Israel's exodus out of Egypt, and how that exodus leads to the founding of a new nation, and that one exodus story, which is really the one the Bundys, white nationalists, certain federal land conservatives, what they hold on to is an exodus story that is really about the United States as a people, and it was white European Americans who were enslaved by Egypt. The Egypt here was Britain. And through a revolution, they came out from bondage. They entered this promised land. And what made them free was escaping the bondage of a powerful government. And so I think within that, what unites many in the Trump supporters is this notion that we have, by accepting government expansion over the last century, we've basically chosen to go back into bondage, and we have to reenact the revolution. We have to reenact our exodus so that we can once again establish the sort of true America. And that's a narrative that works for the people in 1776 who had power, for the people in 1776 who gained power by throwing off the shackles of Britain. But there's an entire America that, if you think about Native Americans, African Americans, in many ways women, their freedom from oppression involved a powerful federal government. It involved the government forcing school desegregation, Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Suffrage Act. And so this other narrative, it's too simple to say, Democrats want big government, Republicans want little government. That's not helpful, but it is helpful to see that freedom for some Americans has been provided by government. And so we are going to be divided if government itself can be simultaneously such different symbols. The symbol of freedom and the symbol of bondage, it means different things to different people. And yeah, we're going to have a tough time, finding ways to talk about that constructively.
You say that you're hopeful that if we can bring some of these debates back to something concrete, like actual Western lands, that might be a safer playing field for debates to be had about some bigger issues. Do you think there's a future where Western land grievance can disentangle itself from these just global, national, right? The government is a tyrant. The government is what gave me freedom. These divides, is there a way that these Western issues can disentangle themselves, can carve out that space to have a debate, like a very productive and often a needed, a necessary debate that we need to have about how do we manage lands and public land use? How do we now begin those conversations without getting them dragged into these other huge movements that just have so much baggage and so much unproductive power?
Yeah, I really don't see a path for what you're describing broadly. In other words, that we have an entirely new or a real transformation at a national level, because for all kinds of reasons, not least of which we haven't talked about, is money in politics. And so I'm not hopeful at all that Western lands are going to produce nationally a new politics. What I am hopeful is that Western lands, public lands, can provide examples of better politics. So in other parts of the country, those examples might come from other things, whether it's education or, pick an area. But where in the West, public lands might be those places that we point to and say, hey, look at how we work together. And one of the possibilities we have, I think, right now, and I'm an optimist, so you can dismiss this, but I mean, if there's one issue that I think we should really focus on with this kind of hope, it's fire in the West. It is
all of us, right?
Yeah, it is simultaneously divisive, right? It's simultaneously divisive because some people blame environmental laws, some people, but the reality is, it's something that can never be made fully ideological. As you say, it affects us all, and you realize that this is where I still remember, Stephen Pine's great book. He talks about the 4 ways to approach fire, and that the problem isn't that one of them's wrong. The problem is one of them is incomplete. And so is there an opportunity where we say, yes, maybe environmentalists could give a little bit on how long it takes to do an environmental impact statement after a burn? Not across the board, but here with this fire that's, and where, but I do think that may be where we could look and see some real, again, I'm not optimistic it'll grow and become the new politics, but where I think people could gain a little bit of hope saying, other ways of doing politics are possible. And that is something that, boy, yeah, if you want a common concern, fire, it's hard to find one that's, better than fire in particularly vulnerable areas of the West. So yeah, I'm optimistic, but in a localized sort of way. But look, we're going to need that. And the one thing I want to say too is, whenever I get really discouraged, because there are a lot of reasons to be discouraged right now, I do look, not surprisingly, I look at history. And, I look at some of the other things, the other moments in American history that surely must have seemed impossible. I mean, abolition, even something, there was a great book on climate change where one of the other examples was smoking. No one, if you're in the 50s, no one's going to get Americans to stop smoking. Well, we largely have. And it's not because someone had the solution. It's that, a number of different streams came together to change public attitudes. So I sort of take some hope too from history that says we might not see the path now. In fact, I don't. But I certainly don't see all the paths. And so I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, enough of us are going to look at the situation now and say, if we keep going, everybody loses, and say we have to find different ways of doing politics, whether it's about federal lands, states' rights, or national politics.
Well, here's to hoping the West can be a shining example, a city on the hill.
Whoa.
No. Oh, wait, no, I'm introducing too much loaded imagery now. I do like that. That's hopeful. And hopefully we can see some of that in future years. Well, I appreciate your time. I really appreciate this book. I'm sorry that it has taken on new relevance and significance, but there's a lot here that we can learn from. So thank you for your dedication to this work.
Thanks again for having me, and it was great talking with you.
All right. Take care, Jamie.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for this month. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll subscribe. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates, leave comments, and communicate with me. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Rudd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream. We have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, fellowships in categories that nearly anyone researching and working on the region from nearly any disciplinary approach or towards nearly any kind of final product can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson, that's Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, just about everything else, so you can direct praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books and other studies on the West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or just about anything else, head to bwrensink.org. That's BWRENSINK.org. Or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind.